Hello, everyone. I am like the Quakers. They don't want to be too early because that leaves time for the devil's play. You don't want to be too late. So here we are, 7:30, starting right on time. Isn't that perfect? A couple of considerations. You see in front of me a stand. If you want to sit down, many of us will not choose that option. Just come to this platform and sit here, and it kind of elevates you so everyone can see. Normally, you're just like me, standing around, talking, and it's going to be a comfortable evening. We're all friends. It's kind of like a little large adult campfire at Sandy Island, so to speak. It is going to be available as a recording for those who very sadly had to miss the event. We've got 13 stories tonight. We're going to have a brief intermission in the middle, and Ian will gently lift some fingers to indicate the elapse of time. We're going to try to keep the stories basically to 5 minutes. What else? It's come to my attention that First Church is becoming such a blended generational place. And so I'd like to encourage those of you who have children, teenagers, to consider a multi-generational Moth Hour. You know, we have stories for all ages on Sunday. Well, how about storytellers of all ages? So, something to look forward at our 10th anniversary. So, I'd like to introduce our first storyteller for the evening, Rachel Greenberger, to tell a story called Duo Longo. What sometimes happens during the pandemic.
I met John Doganchi in the summer of 2007. He and I started working for the same company on the same day. He was a Northeastern co-op intern, so a college kid. I was 29 and considered myself seasoned by that point. John is Turkish, so he spells his name C-A-N. His manager at the company, Erica, called him Can on his first day. So then we all called him Can, until he eventually worked up the nerve to tell us, actually, it's pronounced John, as in John. What I remember about him when I first met him were his twinkly eyes and this huge smile that would take up his entire face. And I remember thinking, what does this guy have to be so happy about? He just seems so cheerful and upbeat. I figured it had to be a front. That was almost 20 years ago. It was not a front. A bunch of the people who worked together in that company have kept in touch. Erica, the manager who called him Can, married me to my husband, Cristiano, who's here filming this for John, and who is celebrating his 15th wedding anniversary with me tonight. Isn't that cute? Yes. Back to the story. And Davide, who also worked at the company, and Cristiano, my husband, have been running a business together for a decade. So we're all still pretty tight. And over the years, we've had reunions, and we would invite John, and John would always come. And I just thought that was so sweet, because he was just our co-op intern for one season, but he kept in touch. So last year, Cristiano and I were going up to Burlington, Vermont for a work event. We knew that John and his girlfriend, now fiance Lucy, lived in Charlotte, which is nearby, so we got together. Said, let's have dinner, we're going to be in town. So we get together for dinner. It had been a number of years since we'd seen each other. So I said, John, what have you been up to? And he said, well, you know, at the start of Trump won, I was really planning to leave the country. He had won a green card in the lottery, so that's how he was staying in the States. And he's like, but I got to get out of here because we've seen what Erdogan did, so we know the playbook, and this isn't looking good, and I'm going to move to somewhere in Western Europe, or I was thinking I was going to move to somewhere in Western Europe. And then, Lucy and I got together, and I moved to Vermont, and Vermont's kind of like Europe, so it's fine. But when I was planning to go, I was going to go to Sweden. And I was like, oh, have you spent a lot of time in Sweden? I've never been to Scandinavia. He had never been to Sweden, and he had no Swedish. So he started studying Swedish. And then the pandemic hit. And while all of us are staring at our phones in existential dread, John is mastering Swedish. He then, in the summer of 2020, gets involved with the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce to help Swedish businesses do business in the US. And then in September of 2021, he becomes the vice president of the New England chapter of the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce, a role that he still holds. And when he finally visited Sweden a couple of years ago, all the Swedes were like, how long have you been here? Your Swedish is so good. He's like, I'm a tourist. I'm visiting for the first time. So I think this story needs a slogan. And the slogan is, if can, then you can. Or, as his LinkedIn profile says, can do.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Ian. I've been hosting these along with Richard for 9 years now. This is our 9th consecutive. Including the pandemic years, we went online for 2 years, I think, and then came back. And since then, this crowd has grown steadily larger, and the storytellers continue to be just as engaging, and we love it. So keep it coming. It's going to happen again next year and the year after that. And if you hear a story tonight and become inspired to tell one of your own, as Richard said, no matter what your age is, we'd love to hear from you. So for those of you who don't know or who haven't heard my spiel before, the Moth Story Hour, of which this is not an official chapter or anything of, we just unabashedly steal the name and call ourselves a Moth-style story hour. The Moth Story Hour was started in 1997 by George Dawes Green, a poet and a novelist living in New York City, who found himself reminiscing about nights spent on the porch in Georgia, telling stories with family and friends and the moths that would gather around the firelight and the lamps and the street lights around. And just that memory and how peaceful it was, how the camaraderie was there, he decided that the name of his new story hour would reflect that. So hence the Moth Story Hour, which has grown since then to international events all over the place that are radio and televised and all of this. So we are not affiliated with them, but we take inspiration from them. So I will, without further ado, give our next storyteller an introduction. Donna Ruvalo is going to come up and is going to tell a story about the cake, international intrigue, and the creation of cake across the pond.
Thank you. Some years back, I had the opportunity to spend my junior year at a study abroad program in London. And it wasn't a traditional program where you landed in a university and lived in the dorm. This program was more designed to foster independence and self-reliance. So for a couple of days, we were jet lagging in the hotel, and then we were sent out to rent a flat, still while we were figuring out how to use the payphone and understand the tube. And we weren't a terribly sophisticated group of international travelers, but we figured it out. We were plucky, we were resilient, and it all worked out. Come the end of the semester, my sister was planning to come and visit, and we would be traveling for a bit, but her schedule changed, and she would only be able to join me to be free to travel at the end of the summer. And I said, well, that's okay. I'll just find a place to live and get a job, stay in the UK until you're here. And a pal from school heard that I was planning to stay and recommended a nearby employment agency where I went to look for a job. This employment agency, Knightsbridge Nannies, was looking for professional nannies, by and large, of which I was not, but they had actually a 3-month position for somebody to spend the summer in the UK with a family that was coming from abroad to travel and visit their family. They were a British family visiting their family in the UK, the Drakes. And the Drakes had a 10-month-old baby boy, George. And so I got the job, and I was ready to travel with the Drakes for the summer. So the first house that we arrived at was Mrs. Drake's sister's home in Sussex. And the home, Troughton Place, had beautiful, magnificent stone building with a dairy and a farm and a chapel and a dovecote and a full staff. So I now sort of had an idea of what this was going to look like. I had seen enough Masterpiece Theater. I knew where my place was. But interestingly, in the world of upstairs, downstairs, I somehow landed between floors. And they treated me more like an exchange student than as the hired help, and I was frequently invited to dinner, and of course, on family outings with baby George on my hip. So let's see. Now, the second place that we went to visit, we were leaving Sussex and going on to Hampshire, and we would be staying with the baby's grandparents, Sir Eric and Lady Drake. Okay, that was a bit of a surprise, and I was a little taken aback, but all good. And we were heading to the town of Alresford, which was actually the watercress capital of England. And in fact, Mrs. Drake told me with some enthusiasm, you would be staying with Sir Eric and Lady Drake for the week, and at the end of the week, you'll be able to go to this wonderful festival, she explained with some enthusiasm. And I thought it was actually quite curious, based on my time in the UK, that there was a weekend-long festival for a green vegetable, but even a sort of a second-tier vegetable like watercress. So Sir Eric and Lady Drake were actually quite lovely, and they lived closer to town. They actually lived in the manor house for the village, and the Watercress Festival would be taking place in the green right next to their home, and in fact, Lady Drake was the honorary chair of the festival. So Mrs. Drake, or Lady Drake now, came into the kitchen one morning while I was feeding the baby, and she said, "Oh my, I've been called to London, and I must go, and cook is away, and I have to make a cake for the bake sale." And I said, "Oh, well, Lady Drake, I can make a cake." And she, "Oh, brilliant." And she handed me a cookbook, and she was off. So that afternoon, I rallied, and I was ready to make a cake, and I opened the cookbook, and there was absolutely nothing recognizable. The measurements, the ingredients, nothing. And I had made a cake from scratch before, but okay. So I started creaming butter and adding eggs and putting in spode teacups of flour and some baking powder and whatever else you put in a cake, and had a bowl of something that resembled batter, and said, okay, well, this is going to have to do. Now, in the Drake's home, like all of the homes we visited that summer, they had an aga. An aga. An aga is a massive cast iron stove that is always on, okay? A big plate, you lift it up, you open the big cast iron door. There's no temperature controls on an aga. So I went and I found Sir Eric, and I said, Sir Eric, can you change the temperature on an aga? Like, how does this work? And he goes, well, my dear, I don't spend a lot of time in the kitchen, but I believe you just open the door and put it in, which is what I did. Back to the kitchen, the cake is in the oven, I need to start making frosting. I could actually make frosting without a recipe, but I'm looking around and there is no supplies to speak of, so I go and hunt down Sir Eric again. And he said to me, confectioner sugar, I don't think that's something we have in England. And I said, okay, went back to the kitchen, started rolling table sugar between 2 pieces of parchment, creamed it into some butter, and it was sort of a granule sweet thing, but it was gonna have to work. Now back to the cake. I opened the oven door for like the 5th or 6th time, pulled out the cake, and they were ski slopes. Really almost unsalvageable. But it's what I had. I needed a cake. So I grabbed some jam from the fridge. I'm frosting, putting some of this ugly, gritty frosting in between it. It's all lopsided. I take some McVitie's from the shelf, and I'm slipping cookies in between the layers so that it sort of is even. I cover the whole thing with the gritty frosting. I shave some chocolate on the side. It actually looked pretty good. It looked like a cake. That's all it needed to do. The next morning, Lady Drake, the baby, the cake, and I head over to the festival. She points over to a tent on the far side of the green where the bake sale is taking place, and she's heading off to open the festival or judge lambs or something. I walk over, and there's a group of volunteers. They're all busy and bustling. The cakes are arriving. I go in and very quietly put the cake on the table and go to leave. Oh, miss, you have to complete the card. No, I'm good. No. You have to tell us the type of cake that it is and the household that it comes from. Oh, the Drakes. Girls, it's the cake from the manor house. Oh, it's lovely, brilliant, lovely. Isn't that great? I left the tent somewhat nauseous. I returned to the house, and I was thinking, what am I going to do? Oh, I know. I'll put the baby down for a nap in about an hour. I'll go back to the bake sale, and I'll buy the cake, and then I'll dispose of the cake, and nobody will be the wiser. Great. Baby goes down. I grab my wallet. I run through the green. I get to the tent. A sea of cakes. My cake is not there. Where's my cake? Sorry, this is a really long one. So the cake's not there. She tells me the cake has been sold. Now I'm really feeling a mess. I go back home. What am I gonna do? It's gone. And I feel badly. I liked Lady Drake, and now I know that I was gonna be humiliating her in her town, which really didn't feel too good. That night we had dinner, and Mr. and Mrs. Drake returned home, cook returned home, and at the end of the meal, Lady Drake stands up and says, I'd like to thank Donna so much for making the cake. It was really a very wonderful thing to do, and I thought it would be so wonderful if we had the cake ourselves. Cook walks into the dining room with the cake. And I didn't know whether I should be happy that it was not out in the community or at home, but if it was divine intervention or just the luck of the plucky, the cake was delicious.
Our next storyteller has another story from the annals of the pandemic. He wrote in his journal over 550 dreams, but one in particular, a kind of 30-year nightmare saga. But when he woke up, suddenly, he realized what it was all about. Please welcome Derek DePasca.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Richard. Some of the details are not, but it's going to be fine. I retired in 2020, and so by the early summer of 2020, that ominous time, confusing and perplexing and so on, but I could safely quarantine at my house back here in Belmont, and I had a studio in the basement, so I could continue to do that kind of work. And I really soon, more than I had expected, I got to enjoy the flexibility of whatever. Also, I didn't have to get up in the morning if I didn't want to. And after a while, though, I noticed that I seemed to be dreaming more than I had previously. And later, I found out that many people reported more dream stuff during the pandemic because things were upsettled, sleeping patterns were changed and all that. But anyway, so at some point I thought, well, the phones, I didn't write them down. I taped them, sorry. But I taped them. I did tape it about 550 of them. The last one was in the middle of 2023, and there were about 550 of them, I think. And until recently, I'd never listened to any of them. And I sort of had wondered while I was doing it why I was doing it. I thought, well, maybe pattern recognition or something or whatever. And I was a retired academic, so I thought you have to make something intellectual about this. Anyway, so I decided, anticipating talking about this stuff tonight with you, I went back and I thought I'd listen to some of them. Well, I went to the ones that were the longest, the recordings, because I figured they would be the most interesting. So I went to one that was about 5 minutes long, and I listened through it. And this was last week, I was playing this recording, and it went on and on and on, and then finally at the end it said, and then I woke up. And then I heard myself sort of giggle on the tape, and I said, it's just as well. Because it was really, really boring. So I looked at a couple others, and guess what? They were pretty boring. I frankly don't remember what they were. There were times in my life, though, where dreams were sort of a big deal. There were 2 long sessions. One was soon after high school, and for almost 20 years, I dreamt about basketball. Because I'd played the game from ages 9 to 18, perhaps, and so it was a familiar motif to plug in all sorts of permutations and stuff. Much later, even before I retired from teaching, but the dream life for a number of years, maybe a decade, centered around Framingham State University. Understandable, a familiar place. And in a way, I sort of thought, well, that's really impressive of the brain to figure it out. Because you didn't have to come up with a new set for every dream. Like the saloon and the sheriff's office and the whatever from the cowboy movies, those post-false fun things. So that worked pretty well. But there was I won't go into those details at all, but there was another one. This gets to the one Richard is sort of talking about. It doesn't end quite the way he said, but there was a long time in the middle of my life, for about 20 years, I had a recurring dream that was ambiguous, and I never figured it out. And it went up, maybe I had it a few times a year for maybe, 10, 15 years, something like that. And not only was it a lucid dream in that I knew I was dreaming, but at some point I'd think, oh boy, here comes that dream again. And this time I'm going to figure it out. Never did. Change frames. 1994. I'm back at Niagara Falls. Of course, right? I'd been there a lot, actually, because I grew up in Northwest Iowa, and I would often drive back and forth at holidays from Boston to Northwest Iowa, and on Interstate 90 to Interstate 80 and so on. And I remembered that Niagara Falls was very near Buffalo. So, And I start to think Niagara Falls had gotten to be an important motif in our family's history. The first time I'd ever been to Niagara Falls, we were on our way back as a family from a trip to the East Coast, and went to Niagara Falls. And while we were there, I'll tell you what happened later. Within a day or two after that experience, we had a terrible car accident on the edge of Chicago, which killed my grandmother, put my mother in a wheelchair for the rest of her life, wounded my sister, and so on. So it was pretty momentous, you know. And so I thought, well, it got to be a habit. So I went back to see Niagara Falls, and I went back every time I went through, no matter the time of day, what time of night. One time about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was talking to the park ranger, and I was trying to reassure him, and he said, well, if you do jump, please jump far out so I don't have to clean you off the rocks. You know, that seemed okay. But also, what also loomed large in our family's memory was at Niagara Falls, there's a little tourist attraction called the Maid of the Mist. I thought there would be nods, people notice that. Well, in our family records, there was a photograph of our family getting on the Maid of the Mist. It's one of those, they take your picture when you get on, and then they sell it to you when you get off. And the photograph of my mother was the last time she was ever photographed while she could walk. So it was pretty heavy duty, symbolic stuff. So I'd been there a lot, and this time I was there, and I decided I hadn't ever done it since, but I'd go on that boat. So I did, along with other larky tourists. You know, we put on foul weather gear. There was lots of yellow, I remember. And you went down to the basin, whatever it's called, or something, puddled around a little bit. Eventually, the boat wanders over toward the Horseshoe Falls. And at some point, you're so close enough to the falls that the spray and the mist coming off of the waterfall sort of overtook the boat, and there was sort of obscured our vision for a while. And just then, the tour guide said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Maid of the Mist." And I started to cry because, of course, that was the dream. Because what happened is my sister had been injured. Did I even tell this part? In the dream, that I could see the fearless Fosdick. I could see the sky through my sister. Well, my sister, in fact, had an emergency surgery, and she was okay, but she'd sort of been shot through the middle. And I never had the dream again. But I thought about it a lot over the years. I still think about it, one, just because of what it is, but also I sort of thought, why in the human evolution didn't our systems wind up being able to make it clearer? Why do we have to puzzle ourselves with dreams all the time? Why couldn't it make it just a little clearer? Maybe, I don't know, come with subtitles, or by now, just send me a text.
Thank you, Derek. So, in the interest of time, and given that we do have 13 stories to get through, I am gently keeping time and sort of holding up some fingers when you've got, you're at 4 minutes, you're at 5 minutes. So don't get offended by that if you are telling stories. But just in the interest of everybody's time, I want to welcome our next storyteller, who's telling a story called The Octopus Furnace, which intrigues me. A story about a father teaching his son a life lesson. Michael Griffin.
So, growing up on the south side of Chicago in a blue cast neighborhood, Saturday mornings consisted of two things: getting up, grabbing a bowl of cereal, watching Bugs Bunny for a half hour, and then chores. So we had house chores all the time growing up, and many times my father would include us with the house chores because he wanted to teach us how to do things around the house. So on this particular morning, September 1972, my father was going to teach us how to clean the octopus. Now, the octopus was this gas-fired furnace that had these air vents coming out all the different sides of it, and when it burst on, the window would blare with fire. And we thought it was fantastic. We always wanted to see the inside of it. So on this particular Saturday morning, he calls us down, me, my brother Pete, my brother Drew. We're going to clean the furnace. First thing we do, we go around the back, turn off the gas. Very important to turn off the gas. And then he tells us, okay, go to the workbench, I need you to gather our tools. So we get the wire brush, we get the little whisk broom, couple rags, and a candle. Why a candle, you might ask? Because the octopus is in a very dark part of our basement where there's no lights or anything, so we had a candle. So we get all the tools together, get around. My dad sits on a stool in front of this big cast iron furnace. I'm smallest, right in front of him. Brother Drew, Brother Pete. Okay, Pete, I want you to grab the handle, and we're going to count down to 3. Just crack it a little bit. 8 sets of eyes looking directly at the furnace. You ready? Yeah, Pa, I'm ready. 3, 2, 1. Whoa! The burst of hot air that flew through the air ignited immediately and then was gone immediately. My brother Drew, awesome. My father, shit. My brother Pete, ah! The gas ball that came out instantaneously burned off all our eyebrows, our hair back this way. My father had a mustache, gone. The rest of the afternoon we spent in our kitchen with Vaseline being applied to our faces, my mother cursing my father for having us do this, and the best part of it, it was picture week at school. Talk about being the star of the class. Beet red face. It's the only picture I have where I don't have eyebrows, and I have this gray halo growing around a beet red face. And the only thing I could say is, moral of the story, we're not blind. We didn't die, so we didn't make the Darwin Awards. And what the hell were we doing with a candle at a gas-fired furnace? We lived. Thank you.
Our next story is titled, You Can Trust the Past, but You Can't Trust the Future. Please welcome John Eggerts to talk about how he worked for the Shah of Iran.
Well, in 1953, I was 7 years old, living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Unbeknownst to me, the CIA and MI6 overthrew the Iranian government and installed the Shah in return for a few barrels of oil. Some years later, I was 30 years old, in 1976, and I found myself in Iran working for the Shah. Not directly, several levels before, I was working for a man named Firuz Ramanzadeh. We had a contract to do a bunch of educational work. He was in charge of the educational TV part of NIRT, National Iranian Radio and Television, which, by the way, our government bombed just a few weeks ago. We were there for a couple of years, and Firuz and I got along quite well together. So when I went back to Syracuse, where I was living at the time, and Firuz called and said, hey, we could use another 10 people over here. Can you send a team? I said, sure. So we sent a team over, and when he got there 10 people plus the chief of a party, he called up, and his name is Paul. He called up and said, John, this is after a week, John, things don't seem right. It's really uneasy. The soldiers in the streets and the people seem really, really restless. I said, Paul, it's a different country, a different culture. Don't worry about it. You'll get used to it. But a week later, Firuz calls me and said, John, I'm leaving the country as quickly as possible, and I suggest your team does as well. So the team actually went down to the airport, got the security, and the security official said, where are your work permits? Because the work permits show that you came there legally and you're leaving legally. And Paul said, well, we don't have them. They're locked in a government office and the government is on strike. The official said, well, that's impossible. It's illegal for the government to be on strike. So Paul went back. He remembered the building where he had left the work permits when he first came into the country. He went into the building and somehow broke into it and went up to the second floor, found the desk that had where he had left the work permits, and grabbed them. And he went back with his team to the airport, and they got through. Somehow Ferouz got through too, but I don't know how he got out. The problem was, NIRT owed my small company $300,000, which is a lot of money back then. And so Ferouz had given me the phone number, the direct line to the head of NIRT, who did report to the Shah. And so I called him up early one morning, our time, and said, Mr. Goadby, we need our $300,000. Our employees can't pay their mortgages, and they're getting really, really worried. He said, I'd like to help you, but right now there are soldiers outside my office, and I don't think I can. 2 months later, I read that he was actually executed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. So go forward a bunch more years, 20 more years. 1996, I was living in Syracuse, and we had found a job for Ferouz, a long-term graduate assistantship to support his family of 4. And I had submitted a claim to the State Department and the U.S. Foreign Claims Commission. And guess what? I got the money after 20 years. So then finally, a couple years later, I learned that Ferouz had passed away, sadly. And I remembered the first time I met him in his office. We were negotiating the contract. Got to some very little details that I didn't think were very important. I said, Ferouz, don't worry about it. I trust you. He looked up slowly. With a very serious look on his face, he said, you can trust me, but don't trust the future.
Thank you. One of the things I absolutely love about this evening is we learn more about each other. You know, I've worked here for 14 years. I know some of you I've known some of you that long. And every night I learn new things about people that I never imagined. I love it. So our next storyteller is our own Richard Waring, who's going to be telling A Tale of Two Birds, a story filled with flying metaphors.
So it's a tale about 2 birds. Not that both birds only had one tail, but it's a story that has 2 birds in it. First bird I encountered when I was in a Humpty Dumpty state of being, divorced, having to move my stuff into storage, go live with my friend Martin Plass. It was very sad. And as I was bringing stuff in and out, I could hear there was a bird. Was it trapped? Was it going to shit on my stuff? What was it doing there? So eventually, I got everything in there and pulled down the roll-top orange shingle-like thing, and I locked it. And just as I did so, this bird came right exactly to my line of vision. It looked me in the eye. It was like a interspecial moment. And I thought to myself, this bird is smart. This bird wants to get out of here. This bird, in fact, wants me to reach out and pick it up because I know how to use the elevator. I reached out. It did not fuss. It trusted me. It was unbelievable. I was so touched. I went to the elevator, pressed down, went outside, held the bird out so it could fly to its home while I was kind of homeless. Well, it didn't go right away. It looked back at me as if to say, thank you. Second bird, a couple years later, I'm starting to have trouble breathing. I'm feeling weak. All of a sudden, my daughter, who's a nurse practitioner, calls because a bird flew down her flue. Daddy, what do I do? Now, here's a kid who, at Drumlin Farm, when she was very little, was pecked by a chick. And she's eaten chicken ever since. Just at that moment, her husband came home, took care of the bird. But while we were on the phone, I said, you know, I'm feeling kind of weak. It was a Friday. But I'm going to see my cardiologist on Monday. My daughter said, Dad, you can't wait that long. Now, when you get into your mid-60s, if not sooner, you have to realize you should start listening to your children rather than them always listening to you. So I took her advice, got in the car, made it to Mount Auburn. When I got there, they said, you're in electrocardiac shock. Only half your heart is working. We need to do stuff to get rid of the fluid, and then you're going to need a valve replacement. I called that bird the Phoenix. It saved my life.
Thank you, Richard. So we are going to take a brief break, have some refreshments in the back. We'll mingle and chat for a few minutes, and then we'll be back in 5 to 7 minutes for another 7 stories. So thank you.
Our next storyteller with a story that he calls, oh, I have to cheat, sorry. The Needle, a story of serendipity and the unexpected in Italy. Please welcome Ian Garvey.
All right. Thank you. So it's been a few years. For my own sake, I'm going to start my own stopwatch there. It's been a few years since I've told a story here, and this one does not have to do with my origins as a, farm community youth, but when I was in my senior year in college, actually between my junior and senior year in college, my brother had just graduated. He's a year older than me. We decided that we were going to take a trip backpacking through Western Europe, like a lot of early 20s do. It was 2006, and we were set to have a great time. We booked ourselves an itinerary where we were mostly sleeping on the train on overnight train rides between cities. Maybe 4 hours, maybe 5 hours. That's fine. That's all the sleep we need. That's one night that we don't need a hostel. And then we would stay in hostels. We showed up at the Heathrow Airport, and they asked us where we were staying. We had, our passports and the booking for one night, and they were like, well, where are you going to stay the rest of the time you're here? Doesn't matter. We'll figure it out when we get there. They almost didn't let us into the country, but they did. And after going through London and then France for a little while, we ended up in Italy, and we had planned to spend 5 days in the Cinque Terre. Many of you have been there or know what it is. We were staying in Rio Maggiore, the southernmost of the villages, and for 4 days, we did just about everything that we could think of. We did the hike north up along the coast between the 5 villages and taking the train back. Lots of hiking, lots of beach time. It was absolutely wonderful. And we were debating, what do we want to do with our last day? We had pretty much ticked off everything that we had wanted to do, and we had done the walk up north to Monterosso, the northernmost city, the town, which takes most of the day. And we were on the train going back, and we were thinking, what do we want to do with our last day? And we looked at the floor, and there was a business card for rent a Vespa. We're like, that sounds perfect. It was for a company in Levanto, which is one town north of that, and we were like, perfect, we're going to do that. The following morning, we decided to show up. We took the train there. The people who worked there didn't speak a word of English. I had 1 year of elementary Italian behind me, and so in very poor, broken Italian, I managed to arrange for us to rent a Vespa. It took a little while to get them to understand that we wanted a Vespa each instead of to share one, and when their 50 euros a day rate, when we told them that, oh, we have to return it tonight, actually, because tomorrow morning we have to get a early morning train to Rome, they were like, oh, well, then it's 25 euros each. And we were like, that's fantastic. So we ended up getting these Vespas. They were brand new. They had to peel the plastic off the seat to actually get them ready for us, and this was fantastic. And they looked at us and said, have you ever ridden a Vespa before? And I said, of course, certo, ma certo. They're automatic, right? Yes. So we wheel them out of sight, and then we sit on them. Never ridden one of these things before. They're a lot heavier than they look. They're a lot more top-heavy than they look. And finally, started trying to ride them. I managed to stay on. My brother fell over once, but it didn't scratch it too much. And we started riding through town and took a random corner, which, at this point we're still 98% of our attention is on trying to control the thing. And we take a corner, and all of a sudden we're being yelled at in Italian, ma vaffanculo, by all these passersby. And it turns out we had turned up a pedestrian-only, Green Market Street, and we're trying to ride through there. Finally got out of that, finally got these things under control and got used to them. The day was spectacular. Amazing weather. We started winding out of the city, and we were just going randomly. This was before we had smartphones. This was before we had a general map of the area, a paper map, and we were just taking random corners. And we started deciding any road that looks like it was going up, because we wanted a view. We wanted to just see what the countryside looked like. And we started winding through vineyards, coming around corners where there was this panoramic view of the ocean, just exquisite, exquisite scenery. And the day just felt like it couldn't get better. We were about ready to have lunch, and we saw a road that was forking off where the sign said Lago, L''AGO. And I'm like, I think that's Italian for the needle. And it's like, well, the road goes up. Let's see what it is. And so we turned there, we wound up, and we came to this village. It was a very small, maybe 15 buildings village. And the top of the mountain, the very top of the mountain, was this little clearing, and all of the houses were set down from it. And you could see 360 degrees, the entire ocean, the entire skyline, and then vineyards behind us the whole way. And we realized this is just the best day ever. And then, behind us, we heard the creaking of a door and a thump and a cane, and an old man walking with a cane came down the stairs, and he asked us in absolutely beautiful English, what are you doing here? What are your names? And we introduced ourselves, and it's like, we're just seeing the sights. We rode up here, and it looked interesting. And he said, welcome, what are you, and he sat down with us, and we started eating lunch. We had hard cheese and bread that we were tearing up and just eating lunch out of a backpack. And we asked him, you speak English incredibly well. Where did you learn it? When I was a prisoner of war in a British prisoner of war camp, but then after we escaped, I spent 3 years working for the Italian resistance, and we were both just stunned. What just happened? So we had lunch with this old World War II vet who told us stories about him driving a truck between Rome and other cities, ferrying supplies, ferrying refugees, and we said our goodbyes, and we rode back down the hill. And what came from a business card on the floor of a train turned into absolutely the best and most memorable day of a month that we spent backpacking through Europe. So that was the needle.
Wow. Stories are great, especially when we survive them. Our next story is called Stay In or Stay Out. Through the dawn of time, kids have been told, stay out or, we don't want to hear the swing of the door that much, right? They were free-range children in those days. Well, here to tell a story about his childhood is Matt Meyercheck.
Thank you. My story has evolved quite a bit since I wrote that, so it's relative, but not the same. So many of you know that I come from a very large family who grew up in a very small house. There were 13 kids plus my parents in a 3-bedroom, 1-story house on the edge of the Minneapolis suburbs at the time. And so it wouldn't be fair to say that my parents actively tried to kill a few of us off, but somebody raising children today, if they were looking back at the way we spent our time, might come to the conclusion that my parents never really lost any sleep about the idea that a few of us might not make it to adulthood. When I was about 2 years old, we were riding in the station wagon. My 2 older brothers were 4 and 5, and we were in the way back, which didn't have seats or seatbelts. I don't think they had invented car seats yet. And the tailgate was down, and we were taking turns holding my younger baby brother in the back. And all of a sudden, we noticed that all the other cars were honking at us and waving, and a policeman pulled us over, and my dad looked around and said, "Who's got Mark?" And it was like, you have. No, the cop says, "I have him." He had fallen out the back, and the car behind us had stopped and flagged down a policeman, and he brought him back, and was like, "Here you go, sir. Have a nice day. Don't worry." We didn't make it on the news. Nobody pressed charges or anything like that. That was just how things were. My mother had this theory, which she told us many times, that if you took a 3-month-old baby and threw it into a pool or a lake, it would instinctively know how to swim because of all the time it had spent floating in the womb. And that once they learned how to walk, they would forget this knowledge, so that if the best way to teach children to swim is to throw them in the water while they're babies. I don't think she ever tried to prove that, but when I was 10, my father said, "If you want to go to scout camp, you have to learn to swim." So we got in the canoe, and he paddled out to the middle of the lake and said, "Hop out." So I jumped out, and he started paddling as fast as he could away from me. And so I'm floundering and thrashing and floundering for several minutes, and then finally, since I hadn't drowned, he decided to come back and get me. And that was his idea of swimming lessons. As we got older, my dad, particularly, who never wore a seatbelt in his life until he had to, he just liked the idea that we were free to take risks and do things that we wanted and have fun. So he started building things like a monorail, we called it. It was a zip line across our yard, 20 feet high, a steel cable. We had large trees and a big yard, so he made this contraption out of washing machine parts and like an old fan belt. And so we would hang on to this pulley, climb up a platform, hang onto the pulley, and go flying across the yard, while all of the other kids would throw things at us to try to knock us down. And then one day he said, "Hey, the street in front of our house goes up a little incline. Why don't you take some scrap lumber and cinder blocks and make yourselves a jump?" So we did, and we would come down the hill and hit the plank and go up into the air, and it'd just be children on bikes flying through the air. I mean, what could go wrong, So one day I took my little sister's bike. It had the high handlebars, and I thought that would be a good bike to try on the jump. I didn't realize that instead of a bolt holding the handlebars on, there was just a rusty nail sitting there. So I got up the hill, I came down, I went up the jump, and the nail broke, and the handlebars went down, and I did about 3 somersaults on the pavement, and ended up lying there on my back in the middle of the street, bleeding from my elbows and my knees. My older sister walked over to me and said, "Are you dead?" What was I supposed to answer, But, all of the houses around were pretty close, and there was at least one mom or somebody home. Nobody would come out and say, "Are you guys okay?" There was just the way things were back then. No, I mean, if it happened today, they probably would have taken me to the ER and done a CAT scan and called social services, But then my father was a big fan at the time. Evel Knievel was trying to jump his motorcycle over the Grand Canyon, and he thought that was the coolest thing. So one day he came home from work for us with a mini bike, a motorized dirt bike. It only had one helmet, and I don't know if it fit any of us, but he would say, "The sledding hill, if you go up the sledding hill, you could probably get up enough speed coming down to jump the creek at the bottom." And so, we had a lot of fun experiences and took a lot of spills and chills. But it was really just my dad's way of showing love and letting us have the kind of adventures that a lot of people wouldn't be able to do today. And as for trying to kill us off, they didn't quite succeed, although they've both moved on. All 13 of us are still here. So.
Thank you, Matt. And so our next storyteller is here to tell a story called The Amateur's Encore, after years of silence, finding her voice again. Laura Miyakawa.
As a kid, I remember feeling like I was waiting to be discovered. I wanted to be plucked from obscurity. I didn't need to do anything or try anything. I just needed to be. I was going to have my sword in the stone moment. Maybe there would be a terrible school bus accident, and I would be the lone survivor. A girl could dream. What actually happened is that I was selected along with a handful of my peers to sing the elementary school alma mater, and I felt like my thing had finally found me. In 6th grade, I was the only middle schooler to have a part in the high school production of The Music Man. And in 9th grade, I was the only freshman to be in the madrigal choir. It was all happening, and it was coming so easily. I started taking voice lessons. I would dutifully bring my cassette tape with me to every lesson so I could record it and bring it home and then stash it in a drawer. I would never listen to it. Because if I did, I might find out that this talent that was supposed to be so effortless might have needed to take a little effort. After freshman year, I went to Interlochen Arts Camp in Michigan. And I was surrounded by these incredible student musicians. My cabin was right next to the practice huts, and so for the first time, I really heard what it took to hone a craft. These kids, they were not waiting to be plucked, they were working for it. At the time, my family owned a small community theater. It was the type of place that put on a Christmas Carol every year. So I had gotten to play every single Cratchit except for Tiny Tim over the years. At the theater, there were 2 types of people. There were the kids who thought that this little theater in a strip mall in suburban Atlanta was just a few blocks from Broadway and it was gonna happen. And then there were the adults who had their regular day-to-day jobs in finance or in real estate, and they would come on the weekends and they would just have fun. As college approached, the pressure of thinking about what it might actually take to be a musician started to get to me, and I started to lose confidence in my voice. When all-state choir and the science fair conflicted, I remember my chemistry teacher telling me that an engineer would always have a job. The implication was clear. And so when I packed for college, I put away childish things. I thought that if I couldn't make it as a musician, it wasn't worth trying. I went off and I did become an engineer. And there was such solace in it. Engineering, there's a right answer. Music, it's so subjective to the whims of a conductor or some nascent talent that I didn't really think that I had anymore. In engineering, my worth was deterministically determined, and I felt real sanctuary in that. Years later, I'm at this Christmas party that my company is throwing, and one of my coworkers brings out a ukulele. And he and I sing Christmas carols for the remainder of that party. And when I leave that job, the organization gifts me a ukulele as a going away present. They all signed the back. It was really sweet. And for years, I toted the ukulele around with me between apartments, and occasionally I would get it out and I would dust it off and I would try to tune it and then I'd put it back under the bed. And when the pandemic hit and we were all looking for new hobbies, my husband's got me Zoom ukulele lessons. And these lessons, I loved them. And playing the ukulele was hard, and I was bad at it. And for the first time in my life, I practiced. And wouldn't you know it, I got a little bit better. And so less than a year from that first lesson, in the darkness of our bedroom, I whispered to my husband that I wanted to try to play Porch Fest that year. Since then, I've played Porch Fest every year, and I've gotten to play at the farmer's market and at some of the open mic nights, and it's been a real joy to bring it back. And I realize that now, looking back at those adults at the theater, that I could never understand. I felt like their dreams were so small, that they had it figured out, that there's such joy in just doing something that you love and sharing it with others.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, Marion Melnick is going to share a story that she calls, "I Sing the Body Electric," Bono once said. And this is a quote. "Music can change the world because it can change people." And Marion thought of that quote when she thought of this story.
Electricity is the movement of an electric charge through matter. And in the two instances I'll tell you about, I witnessed the movement of an electric charge through people. At one time, I was part of a community chorus, and we went to South Africa to sing and to sightsee. And we were in Cape Town, and we took a ferry to Robben Island. This is the prison where Nelson Mandela had been freed from about 9 or 10 years before. And it was still a prison. And it was Mother's Day. And the ferry was filled with disheartened, solemn women going to visit their incarcerated sons. And they watched resentfully as we, obviously privileged, obviously American, as we boarded the ferry. Were we oblivious to their mood? I know I was. And then Nancy Holland, our music director, led us in a song she wanted to sing to the women. The song was Asikatale. It's a song in both Afrikaans and English that had been used in their freedom movement. Asikatale, no masiboswa, si mi se inkululeko. Oh, we don't care if we go to jail. It's for freedom and we gladly go. That changed the mood entirely. The women sat up, they beamed, they were energized, they were proud. They were filled with pride that we, as Americans, had learned enough of their language to sing their song. And it was a song about going to prison. That moment was electric. And that moment stayed with me. There was another time, another choir. This was the choir from our church. And we traveled to Desvalva, Romania. Alpha Bradford was our music director, and she put together a program of songs that included 2 songs in Hungarian. And she practiced us, and we rehearsed for months. And early on in the process, she told us that the song Sike Hymnus was a Hungarian anthem, and that the Hungarian-speaking people who lived in Transylvania, which is a part of Romania, that anthem was sacred to them, and that the Hungarian language, they were not allowed to teach it, they were not allowed to speak it in their schools during the long communist regime, which had only recently ended. I had forgotten that fact by the time the months went by and we were ready to go to Romania. But there we were in the partner church in Desvalva. We had been warmly greeted, but with the language barrier, it was nods and smiles. And the congregation sat quietly in the church and were a little remote. And then Alpha led us in the song, Sike Hymnus. Wow, that quiet room buzzed, it hummed. The people all stood up at once. They crossed their hands to their chest. They cried. Grown men had tears streaming down their face. That long forbidden anthem, that did it. And we in the choir were stunned. So yes, we sing the body electric. Thank you.
My heart is full to overbrimming. I regret to tell you we have only 3 stories to go. However, here's a little bit of good news. Tomorrow, there is a summit to talk about our legacy of slavery. You don't need to put the chairs away. I know so many of you pride yourselves on collecting. Can I get 4 of them? 5? But no, leave everything the way it is. Our next storyteller has a story about a childhood tragedy. The sun came up, and then all was forgotten. Please welcome Mike Whitmer.
Thank you. I've told this story privately a handful of times, but in all my decades on Earth, this is the first time I've told it publicly. So I go back to my childhood. I was raised in Storrs, Connecticut, University of Connecticut. My mother was dean of the School of Nursing. I had a brother who was a year younger. This particular time, it was late April, 1954, 1955, and we had just become Boy Scouts, so there were a group of us, ages 11 and 12. We were very tight. It was a small campus, small town in those days. Just become Boy Scouts, and so we're going on an overnight hike, our first overnight camping expedition. And so it was on a Friday afternoon after school, and so we were, I think, a couple of parents took us to about 5 miles from stores. And in that era, and maybe now still, lots of woods and very few people. And so we were, I think, in Willington amongst pine trees and a field. And there was one adult who was who was in charge, if you will, Mr. Cronin, and 7 or 8 of us kids. So we arrived there late afternoon. We had a campfire, cooked our dinner, and everything seemed just fine. We then got in our pup tents. We each had a little pup tent and sleeping bags, so we each went into the woods and got into our sleeping bags at 9:30 or 10 and fell asleep. It started to rain, not downpours, but I can remember a drizzle. And I heard a car running in the middle of the night, and kind of how you half wake up and hear something and you don't know what it is. And so I didn't think anything of it, went back to sleep. And about 6 a.m., dawn, I was awakened by a blood-curdling scream from Brian Cronin, Mr. Cronin's son. And then I heard my brother yelling to everybody to come here. So we all raced to the car, and the car was running. And Mr. Cronin was in the back seat, and he had put a pea jacket sleeve over the exhaust and run the coat into the back seat. And he'd been there all night. The door was locked, car still going, so we smashed the window, turned off the car. It was a 2-door car in those days, and he was in the back seat. So we had to push the front seat up. And I was the one who was grabbing his body to take him out. He was stiff. I'd never seen a dead body before, but I knew he was dead. We dragged him out and put him on the ground, and Jan Northby gave artificial mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the one chance in 1,000 that he would revive. And then Quentin Kessel, another camper, he was a runner. He ran to the nearest house, which was probably a mile away, literally. And so they called the only doctor in Eastern Connecticut, Dr. Gilman, and he came, and the ambulance came, and police car, probably the only policeman in Eastern Connecticut too. And they all took charge, and they drove us home. And I remember vividly, it was about 8 a.m. then, and my mother, she had come down the stairs. She'd heard about this, and she heard us coming back home. She came down the stairs. She was still in her bathrobe and wrapping. And we came running in, and I remember saying to my mother, promise me you will never do that. Promise me you will never, ever do that. She said, I promise. We had breakfast. Then about 11 o'clock later in the morning, we went out, Eric and I and other kids in the neighborhood, some of who had been on the hike, others who hadn't. The sun came out, and we were just sitting there or running around playing as we would do when nothing had happened. And I have always been struck, even haunted, by the juxtaposition of the horror of what happened in the morning and the bucolic, beautiful, sunshine, early spring day in this marvelous campus setting. And my mother and other adults never talked about Mr. Cronin's suicide ever again. Thank you.
Wow. Well, with the unenviable task of coming after that story, Ranganath Nayak is going to share a story about a trip to Delhi and then back to Cambridge with barely a dime in his pocket. Ranganath.
Come, children, and be with your grandfather as I tell a story. So this is a story of adventure and romance from the year 1986. 1966, I'm sorry. I had just then proposed to my intended Sandy and extracted a promise from her that she would not answer because I was sure she would say no. And I had also by then saved up enough money from my work at MIT to be able to afford to go back to India to visit my family. So I got a plane ticket and I flew to India. And there I spent time with my family and my dogs and just enjoying myself. And one of the visitors we had in India at that time was a Scottish family. And they had a daughter who was beautiful. And for the moment, I forgot about Sandy. And I asked her what her name was, and her name was Fiona Fraser. And she was a student at a college in Scotland called St. Andrews. And I got her address and determined to go and see her. Well, how was I going to do that? I didn't have money to go anywhere on the way back, but my parents had some. And they had friends and relatives in different cities, including in Rome and in Zurich and in London. And they just arranged for me to go and stay with those people. So I arrived in Rome, and I went to the house of these people who were strangers to me, but they were friends of my parents, and they welcomed me. And I didn't know what to do in Rome, and they said, go and see the Bernini Museum. And I went to the Bernini Museum, and it is full of beautiful statues, I have to say, of naked women. And in their bookstore are postcards with these beautiful women on them. And I bought one, and I sent it to Sandy, saying, thinking of you. As I later found out, at that same archaeological camp was the guy who was competing with me for Sandy's hand, and he had to carry the mail and distribute it to everyone. So I had a good time in Rome, and then I went to Zurich. I made my way by bus to the family that I was supposed to stay with, and the superintendent of that place said, they're on holiday, they're not here. So I started wandering around with my suitcase, wondering, what am I going to do? And finally ended up in a pub, thinking they might have a room upstairs and perhaps I could stay there. And they said no. But then I saw two people sitting and having beer. And I went up and tried to introduce myself. One of them spoke only German. One spoke German and some French. And I had a little bit of French because I had studied it in school. And they found out that I had no place to stay. One of them had a car. They volunteered to take me to a YMCA and find me a room for the night. And they did. And then as they were leaving, the person who spoke only German said through his friend, "We'll come tomorrow and you can come home and have breakfast with us." So the next day I went and had breakfast with this complete set of strangers. And it was pleasant because they had a kid who spoke a little bit of English. The wife spoke a little bit of French, so we were able to communicate. And they said, "Tomorrow we're going into the mountains to visit our aunt, and we're going to spend the weekend at her farm. Would you like to come with us?" And I said, "Sure." So I ended up in this farmhouse in the mountains of Switzerland, where there was a railway going up the steep hill, and I was in the attic on a mattress that was this thick, full of down feathers, and I slept on that, and the family cat came and slept on my stomach. It was just heavenly, and it was so unexpected because I'd always heard the Swiss are very hard to get to know. So from there, I went to London, but there was nothing to see in London, and there was something in St. Andrews. So I got a train ticket and went up to Edinburgh, and then took a bus, went to St. Andrews, and walked, and this is, of course, with my big suitcase in hand, walked to St. Andrews, where I was informed that they were on vacation and there was nobody there. So I walked out, went out into the street, looking for a place to spend the night, and ended up seeing a policeman who was directing traffic. And I went up to him and said, "Can you tell me some place to stay?" And he looked at his watch and he said, "I'm going off duty in 5 minutes. Why don't you come with me? I have a spare bedroom in my house and we can rent it to you." So I went there, and indeed it was a newlywed couple. The husband was Scottish, the wife was Irish, and they had a bedroom, and it had one of those little meters into which you put money and it turns the heat on. And I had a wonderful evening there. And then from there, I made my way home to Cambridge. What is the lesson you take away from this, children? Strangers can be absolutely incredible.
Thank you, Rangana. And so last but certainly not least, we have one more story to hear called The High School Heebie-Jeebies, How a Shopping Trip with Mom Went So Wrong. Here is Sheila Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, everybody. It was a beautiful June Saturday, a cloudless blue sky. And my mother decided to take my sister Maureen and me shopping. We were just going to run errands. So we went to a few stores, and the last store of the day was Weepin' Willie's. And there was no G on Weepin' because this is the city of Worcester, and there are many letters we don't pronounce. So Weepin' Willie's was a fruit store, and it was very basic. The fruit was displayed in these rough wooden carts that if you rubbed your hand on the crate, you'd get splinters. So as you walked into the store, if you went left, that was the front where the registers were. If you went right, that was the back. So we entered the store, and somehow my sister and I ended up in the back and my mom in the front. And I think my sister and I were just chit-chatting. And suddenly, one of the sales girls came galloping in our direction with electrifying relish. And we knew who she was. She was a classmate of my sister's. We all went to a small all-girl Catholic high school in Worcester. And so June, her name was June, June came racing toward us and she said, "You guys are not gonna believe what's happening." And we said, "What?" Now, of course, we were learning at school and also at home the sinful nature of gossip. But fundamentally, we're human beings. So like Eve, we took a bite of that apple. And June said, "There's some crazy lady at the front of the store who rubbed her leg accidentally against one of the fruit crates and ripped her pants and went up to the manager and said, 'I want the price of my pants in fruit as compensation.'" And June said, and the manager said, "Lady, how much are your pants?" And that's when June came running over to us. Now, my sister Maureen stood on her tippy toes to look to see who was this crazy lady at the front of the store. And she gives me a good swift kick in my shin. And at that point, June had to leave because she was on duty. And Maureen said, "It's Mom." I'm like, oh no. So we're in high school. If you are 1 degree off of the norm, either in appearance, in language, or behavior, you are ostracized. So we simulated the Viet Cong. We got crouched down and weaved our way through the labyrinth of fruit crates to get out of the store. And at this point, I'm sweating bullets. I'm like, I hope June and Mom and we do not intersect. So we ran into the parking lot, and it's boiling hot. It's asphalt. We ran to the car, and it's locked, of course. We're crouched down behind the car because we don't want June to come out. We don't want my mother to come out. We don't want that, like, conflagration. My mother comes out. "Where were you girls?" We think, "Oh, Mom, it was so hot in the store, we had to leave." My mother said, "It's hotter out here than it is in the store," which was true. We got in the car, and my mother said, "You wouldn't believe what happened." We're like, "What, Ma?" "Well, I was walking by a fruit crate, and I ripped my pants, so I said to the manager, I would like the price of my pants in fruit." And wow, that happened. And so we said to my mother, "Well, how much did you tell him the pants were worth?" And she said, "Well, I told him I got them at a secondhand shop behind the hospital, and I got the best deal. They were only $6. And we said, "Mom, you don't lowball yourself in the negotiation. This was your one chance to tell him the retail price of your pants, the replacement value. You'll never get these pants again at the whatnot shop." And she said, "Are you suggesting I be dishonest?" It was like, "Oh, no, 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 Mom. We just want you to get your money's worth." Anyway, we went back to school that Monday. And sure enough, at the change of class, the corridors are packed. June is at one end. My sister and I are at the other. And June yells out, "You guys, what about the crazy lady at Weepin' Willie's?" And the whole corridor goes quiet. And all of our friends are like, "Tell us about the crazy lady." "Oh, you had to be there. I cannot repeat this story." So my mother is now at the heavenly banquet where she's having fruit in abundance. And I am trying to live her principles. 1, seek justice. 2, self-advocate. 3, keep your eyes peeled for a good bargain. And 4, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, that does it for this evening, the 9th consecutive First Church version of the Moth Hour. Thank you all so much for being here. It's so lovely to see such a full audience. You've been fantastic. And again, if you would like to tell a story, whether you are a first time, although you are especially encouraged if you have not told a story yet, or if you have another story that you would like to share, email Richard and myself. Chances are we will be doing this again for the foreseeable future. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening. Again, leave the chairs.